afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Lindsay, a Communications and Marketing Specialist here at Beyond 20. I'm going to introduce our panelists for today really quickly, and then we'll get rolling. We're going to be talking about tips for a successful ITSM assessment today, and you're going to be hearing a lot of Brian Flora and Andy Rivers. Brian is a principal here at Beyond 20, and Andy Rivers is a senior advisor with us. They both have over 15 years experience, so they've got a lot of wisdom to share. Any questions you have, they'll answer. If you want to just type them into the comment bar, I'll keep an eye on those as we go and interject with any questions or comments you guys might have. So I will pass this over to Andy to get us rolling.
All right. Thanks, Lindsay. Yeah, as Lindsay mentioned, please ask questions throughout the webinar today. We enjoy getting rudely interrupted by Lindsay with questions. So please keep them coming. So as Lindsay mentioned, myself and Brian will be the ones kind of talking through this today with you. I come from the University of Tennessee before joining the Beyond 20 team, and so we're going to talk about assessments today, and I've had the joy of being on both sides of assessments now. So, from a customer perspective, plus as a, person conducting an assessment. So these tips come from both points of view, and they're intended to allow you or give you a framework so that you can prepare yourself for an assessment and get the most out of it.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. That's true, and one of the things that I think it's probably worth talking about at this point is sort of, why should I even bother to do an assessment in the first place? Like, why is this something that's worth doing?
Often we look at that and we're like, okay, why are we doing an assessment? Why not just charge ahead on our own? And some of the things we're going to give you is the fact that you want to have a roadmap at the end. Well, that's one of the tips we'll talk through. But what this allows you to do, if you have an assessment, you get a really honest view of where you're at now, and then you get the steps of where to go next. And so it helps you prioritize. It helps you get things aligned. Also, it makes sure that you don't skip critical steps that you might not have been aware of, or just didn't self-assess correctly and realize, oh, hey, we are pretty weak in incident. We need to fix incident before we move on to configuration management. So you get a good, honest view of where you're at now, which then allows you to move forward in a much more productive way.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think, the biggest reason for me is because this is where we start, right? That if we look at this from a classic project management standpoint, if the three of us decide that we want to, we have a project and we want to get to Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas, and that's our project outcome. Well, everything we do on our project, all of our timelines, our budgets, our methodology, every aspect of that project is going to be different based on whether we're starting in Washington, D.C. or San Diego or, across the street, right? So if those just getting the idea, getting that baseline assessment so you have some point of later comparison, and so you can sort of, as you said, start to prioritize and look at the things that will maybe give the most business value quickly, can really pay dividends down the line as this project gets going.
Right, and the other thing is it's a very good way to leverage the expertise from professional organizations so that you don't go down common mistakes, or you get the benefit from their lessons learned and their experience, and so that you can hopefully have a much more successful and quicker implementation.
Yeah, sounds good. So let's jump right in. What's our first tip here?
I'll let Brian tell you a little bit about Beyond 20, then we'll jump into our first tip.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. See what I'm talking about? You got to know where you're starting. Beyond 20 is a professional services firm that specializes in ITSM and Agile project management. So, the name Beyond 20 actually comes from this notion that 80% of your mission-critical downtime comes from what we call people and process failures, and then only collectively, only 20% comes from hardware failures, software failures, natural disasters, all that stuff put together accounts for about 20% of root time, but the rest of it is the hard work of people and process, and that's really the area that we focus on. Our services primarily land in three silos. It's consulting, assessments, and training. So, we can help organizations to learn about these kinds of best practice frameworks like ITIL and Scrum, the PMBOK and so forth. We can also help to implement those things through consulting and tool implementations. So we do a lot of work with the Cherwell Service Management platform. And of course, as we're talking about today here, we do a lot of work with assessments, and it's an area that's near and dear to our heart. So let's talk about how we might be successful at these kinds of things. When we talked about this initially, when we look at this this webinar, the notion came from the idea that we've done quite a lot of these assessments in the last few years, and we were sitting around the office kind of talking about lessons learned and things that we would want to pass on to newer consultants or to customers that were looking to do these kinds of things to make sure that these projects go well, that they kind of avoid the common pitfalls. And so we ended up coming up with about 8 things that we all sort of unanimously agreed were really critical to making this happen. What was the first one, Andy?
The first one is defining your scope. And so you kind of equated this to project management, and just like that, step number 1 is, what's our scope? What are we going to do? And this sounds like, one of those simple things where you're like, well, of course we'll know our scope. But what we find so often is people take the scope and they say, hey, we've heard of ITIL and IT service management, so we want an assessment on all of it. Assess us on all the processes. That's not really a realistic outcome from that, because you're doing some of these things now. Some of them you need to do better. Some of them you need to have in your pipeline down the road. But if you spend so many resources going an inch deep across all these processes, you're not really going to end up with a good, solid, actionable plan. And so what you want to do is define exactly where's our pain points now, where do we think the most value's at, and scope that down to specific areas, not just this idea of, hey, we're going to start doing IT service management. It kind of goes into one of those things we always say that, IT service management is not a destination, it's a journey.
Absolutely.
And so this is kind of our map, or, to get us going. And there's not really this, hey, we're going to do this assessment. They're going to give us, these things to do for each one of these 26 processes, and we're going to be done with IT service management in 6 months.
Yeah, no, that's so true. This comes up for me. I'd say this has been an issue that's at least been a major topic of conversation in probably about 70% of the assessments that I've been involved in. That sometimes people, as you say, they think, hey, we want to get assessed on everything. Come in and tell us where we are on all of this and give us a roadmap to implement it all. And of course, that's, as you said, not really realistic. So, what I always recommend people do is to pick 4 to 6 processes, right? Start with 4 to 6 processes and identify, where you are on those processes. You can kind of, get an idea of which ones are going to give you the best business value based on some of the things that you're experiencing, pain from. But, narrow it down to those, to that narrower scope, and then make sure that you've got a plan going forward from there. What's next?
That directly leads into tip number 2, which is focus on those core processes first. If you're really struggling with incident management, you're not going to get the most bang for your buck by coming in and doing an assessment on service asset configuration management. You got to get your incident management under control so that your firefighting's under control and you have a solid core to start from. Some of the common ones we see is doing incident management, request management or request fulfillment, and problem management, and looking at the service desk all together. That's a kind of solid, logical approach to take to those processes where you're focusing on your quick responses, our sort of firefighting, and maturing that in the problem management where we're becoming more proactive and we're getting to the root causes of things. So that's a common place that people start with the core processes. Another set that flows well together is change management, service asset and configuration management, and release management. All of those kind of work together. You don't have to do these bundled this way. That's just a common way we've seen them.
If you're looking at saying on an assessment that, hey, we want to start by looking at, demand management or design coordination or something like that, that's fine. You can absolutely assess those processes and build a roadmap for how to go forward with it. But it just becomes very challenging to get the whole picture on those if you're not really looking at the core elements as well, because what you might find is that if we're trying to do demand management and we haven't really matured our capacity management process, for example, then we won't be able to really get a good picture or actionable roadmap to go forward with that. The only other thing I'd say on that is that when we talked about in the previous slide, we said, let's go with 4 to 6 processes. Kind of where I usually end up looking at that is that when you look at and you're trying to decide, do I do 4 or do I do 6, you might pick 4 of them that you know that you're doing some of, right? So if we said we wanted to do incident management, request fulfillment, problem management, and change management, then we might say, okay, those are going to be our 4. And then if maybe we know we're not actually really doing a lot of release management, that's a really immature process, then that might be something that's still a manageable thing to add as a 5th process, not because we need to be told, hey, guess what, you're not doing this, but because there's value there to saying, okay, what are the first steps we need, in order to go forward with this? How would we go about starting to mature this one?
Yeah, exactly. So it fits into the roadmap, which is one of our tips here, the next tip actually. But I also wanted to hit on one thing too. When we talk about these core processes, you talked about how they interrelate, demand and capacity. Another example we see a lot is, people want to start with service asset and configuration management, which we often describe as content and context. Okay, the content, what all do we have? So you've identified all your assets, all your configuration items. You've put them into a database, you've done all these relationships, you have a great sort of a view of your entire infrastructure, of your entire things that you support. If you don't have change management in place to help you maintain that, starting day one, whenever you've done that, it's now starting to lose integrity around it. It's becoming less and less reliable unless you have some control mechanism around it. So that's another one of those where if you're going to do some of these things, change management's a solid one to get done early because it helps you maintain the integrity of the other processes. So let's go on to tip number 3. And so this is the idea. You want to focus your end deliverable from an assessment should be an actionable roadmap. It doesn't help us very much is if at the end of this we end up with here's all the things you're doing wrong. Like, well, okay, well, that's great. How do we get better? And that's what you want. You want that accurate picture so that you have that starting point. As Brian mentioned, we're going to travel to Las Vegas. Well, are we starting in D.C.? Are we starting in Phoenix? Are we starting in San Diego? So you need to know where you're starting. But the main outcome from the assessment should be a roadmap. How do we get where we want to be? And that needs to be, actionable things. So you need to be able to take action directly on these things. How are you going to define them out? What team's going to do what? You need to be able to really start rolling this out in your organization.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you that, one of the biggest feedback items we get from folks if they have hesitation around doing an assessment, it's because nobody's really got an appetite for, what you can kind of see the eye rolling for, oh no, another assessment where somebody's just going to come in and tell us what's wrong with us, right? You're just going to come in and tell us all the ways that we're terrible, or, and so on. And that's not really helpful. That doesn't give you a lot of value. So, I think it's really important to understand and to communicate that to everyone that's participating in the assessment that we are, that the real focus is on saying, okay, it's not what you're doing wrong, it's what's next, right? How do we get better, and where are the things that we can really, itemize over the short, medium, and long term that are really going to drive value.
And, one of the things we often say is the difference between an audit and an assessment. This isn't an audit, it's an assessment. I want to know my starting point, and I want a roadmap that'll help me get where I want to go. All right, so we'll move on to point number 4. You really need to get 360 degrees of review and feedback. And so what I mean from that is you want to involve, levels of management, individual practitioners, individual team members. Customers is a big one that we highly recommend involving. Customers is probably the touchiest point whenever we have assessments as to whether to involve customers or not. And our recommendation is to always involve them because they give you great insight into how are you really performing. Customer perception is huge in that, and so you want to capture that. this provides you with a great way to prioritize that roadmap. And so
Yeah.
by getting customer feedback, if you can prioritize some of their very high value things that they need first, you're going to get immediate buy-in from your customers.
Yeah, this is one of those things that, especially it really even helps with scoping. So, what you find is that, let's say, we look at something like incident management where we go and we talk to senior management in IT, and you look at the process, the scope of the assessment, and they say, you know what, we're really good at incident management, we're really good at problem management, we're good at change management. We think we really need to work on capacity management and configuration management. Okay, well, then when you go and you talk to IT staff, the sort of process practitioners, the people that are doing it every day, and they say, yeah, I think we're okay at incident management, but actually our change management process is really onerous and it's really hard for us to effectively do. And then you talk to customers, and your customers maybe say, yeah, these guys really stink at incident management. We really just want to see them better on the service desk. And so forth. So that different perspective, it's interesting when we go out and we survey and we interview. Sometimes you learn as much from the differences in opinion as you do from the actual responses themselves, right? The idea that, wow, it turns out that IT management and IT staff have completely different perspectives on this process, and that kind of gives us a place where it might make sense to dig a little deeper and try to find out why that might be.
And I'll, piggyback off your example of incident management there. Sometimes we've seen people are judging the success of their current incident management by, hey, we're only getting a few calls a day. And they think, oh, well, we're doing good. Nothing's going down. People aren't calling us. Well, you go meet with the customers and they say, well, we're not calling because we don't get help. It's not that we don't need things. We're not calling in and submitting incidents. So there's a difference there between the level of service you thought you're providing and what your customers perceive. And that's
Sure.
definitely an area that you would want to focus on.
Right. But, again, as long as it's not just focused on saying, hey, you guys are terrible, but on saying, okay, these are the actionable items that we can take care of.
Exactly. Like in that scenario, it'd be like, okay, here's the reasons why your customers aren't calling. Maybe it's they don't know how. Maybe you have a number, but you don't have email, where they can email in and they're like, we really wish we could email. So all those types of things of, well, they're not calling in. Well, why? And how do we get them where they will? That's what you want in your roadmap. All right, so let's go to the next tip here. When you look at the assessment, you want to make sure you include the people, the processes, and the technology. You want to talk to people or the groups and make sure, okay, can our people, do our staff have the skills and capabilities to do these things? Are there processes in place? How mature are they? And are our tools assisting us? Are our tools making us more efficient?
And when we look at people, there are so many dimensions there, right? But when we look at that, we can be talking about looking at things like the cultural issues. Are we really culturally ready to adopt this new process or this new way of work? Are people not following this process because it's too new, it's too different, or do they not necessarily have the skills to follow the process? So do we need to start looking at training aspects? We need to look at communication. What is it that we need to address there? Process, everybody sort of thinks about that being what we look at. Oh, well, the assessment, we're just going to go look at what we do and look at what the ITIL book says, and that's easy, right? Well, not necessarily, but finding the gaps between maybe what we're doing, but also what's maybe missing or what's a little too complicated to manage or whatever. And then when you get into the technology side, as you said, is technology really providing is it being the enabler that we need it to be?
What we also try and find out with this part is, did you buy a tool to fix a process problem? Is that part of the issue there that we commonly see that as well? But let's go on to step number 6 here, and so that one's active management support. And so again, this is kind of mirror some of the things we talk about project management, but it is hugely important with an assessment. Do you have that top level buy-in? Are they stressing to their management team and trickling down to the team members of how important this is?
This is so critical, because what we find is that when we come in as assessors and we start looking at processes and look at how people are working, then you know, a lot of the staff will very naturally have a lot of concern about that and what that means. So, you know, it's really important in the beginning for management to go in and help to reassure people that, okay, this isn't going to be something that is, you know, looking at you know, trying to find flaws in you, and this isn't something that, you know, is meant to be a bad thing. This is a way so all of us can try to get better. So you have to have that, but then you also need, as you said, ongoing management commitment. So, you know, once the project kicks off, it's not just, you know, kicking it off and saying, hey, everybody, rah, rah, let's go do this. It's having somebody who will follow up and make sure that people are participating. That means, you know, helping, if we're the assessors, that means helping getting the meetings scheduled and making sure people are showing up. And if we send surveys out, following up to make sure that people are actually completing the surveys and that they're responding, because there's not that management commitment, then the project won't have the level of data and participation that you need, and that only hurts you.
And like Brian said, this is so critical to, you know, how the internal staff view the project, to how the customers view it. You know, we mentioned really wanting to go talk to the customers. Well, if they see that buy-in from the senior management, from the top level, your customers are much more engaged at that point because they know you're taking it seriously. They know there's going to be some action behind this, that this is a top priority for your organization. It really helps all aspects of the assessment.
Hello, Vince Vaughn. This is also something that, you know, as soon as people see that senior management is engaged and actually buying into it, then what you'll see is that people will volunteer more information because they suddenly start to see this as an opportunity to, you know, a lot of the people that work on your team, they know things about, you know, they've been thinking about different ways that something could be improved, and they'll be more likely to volunteer those things up if they know that, you know, they think this is a channel by which they might be able to get that done.
If they view this as a way, hey, I can really give some input, that this will make a difference, that it'll make it all the way to the, you know, the top management of, hey, here's some ways that we can make things better. Staff really love that. I mean, think about ourselves when we work somewhere. We know how to make something better. We want to make it better. We want to tell somebody. We want to have an action plan to do it. That's just what we do. Point number 7, you really want to assign an internal project manager to this. This is really critical to making your assessment be more efficient and hit all your timelines. You know, one of the things we do, and this kind of goes in hand when we talked about the people, process, and technology, we do a lot of interviews, we do surveys, and we do observations. And so we'll interview team members, management, customers. Then we send out surveys and say, okay, you know, within these parameters, how are things actually working? And then we actually go observe and say, okay, how are people really doing this? You know, they told us this is how they do it, this is how they answered the survey, then let's see them do their work day in and day out. It takes an internal resource to help whoever's doing your assessment get all that done, from setting up the meetings to identifying the stakeholders that should be met with, to, as Brian mentioned, you know, driving the surveys to completion, helping get those things out. You know, all of that takes time and effort.
And it's not that you necessarily need to have somebody on this full time or anything like that, but, you know, one of the things about, you know, doing an assessment is that you can't really self-assess very effectively, right? Sort of by nature, you're going to end up having somebody come in as an outsider with an external perspective, and that's great, but an external assessor is not going to be able to effectively influence these kinds of things, like, again, scheduling meetings, making sure people show up, those, you know, because there's no, you know, authority for that, and so we need someone internally to help with that.
Right, and thanks for making the point there too. This isn't a, you know, a full-time FTE throughout the entire assessment, but it is somebody on the team that you give them as a go-to, that you have one person to help you kind of arrange and set all these things up, so that you don't want your whoever's doing your assessment to be floundering around trying to figure out how to set up meetings. That's not the best use of their time or yours, quite frankly. And so having this sort of internal person help coordinate all that just makes your assessment go much smoother. Point number 8 is you got to be ready for the results. You know that, as Brian mentioned, a lot of times we don't self-assess well. You know, that's some of those things that kind of goes against human nature. One of the things you have to be prepared for is sometimes things are going to come out and maybe reflect on an area you thought you were doing really good, but you're not doing so good. And you need to be prepared for that and be prepared to respond to it.
Yeah, this is one that, just about every time we do an assessment report, we're all, sitting around the table after we get done with it, and there's always a little bit of consternation before we go present to the customer, kind of going, oh boy, they're going to hate to hear this, right? But, we always try to present what we call, the unvarnished truth, right? We want to come in and say, okay, this is the truth about what's happening in your organization. And I guess the point we're trying to make here is that can be sometimes a little tough to hear, but you have to be prepared to look at those things and say, okay, that's what's going on now. Let's not get bogged down in trying to dispute the results or discredit these results or whatever. Let's try to figure out now, okay, if that's the truth, what do we do next, right? How do we fix that? How do we get better?
Yeah, so that's one of the things too. We mentioned, that we do interviews, we do surveys, we do observations. That way, when we do have these types of things come up in the report, they're data driven. We have data around this is how people answered the survey. This is what we heard in the interviews. This was what was followed up in the observations, so that it is sort of the unvarnished truth, as Brian called it, but it is the truth. It's all based on this. So it wasn't just, hey, we talked to this one person and they said this is how it is. It's a really big encompassing view so that okay, now we thought we were going, we're going to Vegas. We thought we were leaving from, San Diego, but we're really leaving from Phoenix. And so now I know where my starting point is. And now, as Brian mentioned, I can start focusing on those action items. I don't need to start picking it apart and going, no, we're not in Phoenix. We're really in San Diego. The truth is there. The data is there to back it up. That is now where we are starting from. Let's get started.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that we talked about a little bit that didn't really make the tips list, but kind of along the lines of accepting those results is kind of focusing on facts. One of the things that we find a lot of times if we go in and we talk to folks, we do interviews across, that 360-degree review, like we were talking about, is, sometimes like with change management, for example, you might find that you talk to one group of people and you ask them, what percentage of changes are bypassing this process? Do you have any issues with unauthorized change? And one group might say, no, absolutely not. We've got that nailed down. Culturally, we have zero tolerance for unauthorized change. Well, then you talk to the next group and they might say, oh yeah, the process is pretty good, but a lot of people bypass it. So, when we're getting two different opinions on that or two different points of view, the important thing is not necessarily just to cast that as the assessment report. Well, some people said X, some people said Y. That's something that tells us that we need to go in and dig a little bit deeper and find out what the actual truth is, right? Say, okay, well, the perception was this and the reality is actually this. And, sometimes it turns out that data is not available. So maybe you can't find that information. You can't find whether, group A has the right of it or group B, and that tells you something else too. That tells you that, hey, maybe part of our issue here is that we don't really have good reporting and metrics around this process. So that gives us a different kind of action item than we might be expecting.
But no, I mean, all that's great because you get back to where are we at, and then that dictates where do we need to go next. And so, as Brian mentioned, sometimes we'll see these indicators that tell us we need to dig in a little bit more. And so that's where the additional interviews come in at. That's where we found huge benefit in doing the observation. Okay, hey, you told me you did this. Now let's go watch you do it. Let's go sit in a cab meeting. Let's go sit in the knock. Let's go sit in the service desk, and let's just see how things go day in and day out. That's a really great way to get an accurate picture of how things are going. So here's a look at all the tips here together. One was define your scope. And as Brian mentioned, your scope, a realistic scope for an ITSM assessment is around 4 to 6 processes. It's not, hey, let's all look at all 26 processes, but let's focus in on a few. And, one of the things I don't think we mentioned when we talk about that was, remember, number 3 is we want an actionable roadmap. We can't take action on 26 processes at once. And so that's another thing to think through is, okay, how much can our organization actually consume and do at once? And if you've got an in-depth analysis on 26 processes, A, that's going to be a monumental effort, and B, you're not really going to be able to execute on that. No organization is nimble enough to be able to do that. So tip number 2 is those core processes first. Really start on those core processes and then add on to them as you mature among those. If you really want to do capacity management, well, you kind of got to look at demand management first, because that's a really big intake into capacity management. Tip 3 was that actionable roadmap. I want to be able to get my known starting point and then give me the steps that I need to get where I want to go. Where do I want to succeed? Where do I want to be on my roadmap? Give me a plan that's defined as here's your short term, your midterm, and your long term. 4 was the 360-degree review. You want to include management. You want to include individual team members. You want to include customers. You really want to get an accurate view of where you are right now, and also the feedback to help you prioritize and define what that roadmap going forward is going to be. Tip 5 was looking at the people, process, and technology. It really takes up all 3 of those. As Brian mentioned, what's the culture of your organization? What's your staff level like right now? What are their current skills and capabilities? What are our processes now? Are they defined? Are they ad hoc? Are they defined but no one's following them? Where are we at within those processes? And then technology. Is technology being an enabler, or is it being a hindrance? And so, or do we need technology in certain places to make us more efficient? So all of that rolls up into providing, a good picture of where we're at and where we need to go. 6, with the active management support. Do we have, high-level executive support through this assessment from the very beginning, from that first kickoff of, hey, this is why it's important. This is what we want out of it. I want your feedback. We value your feedback, and it's going to be part of the end result, down to, are we talking about it in their weekly meetings of, hey, how's this going? So that it's starting with that management team, it's coming down to the individual levels of management, all the way down to the team members to show, hey, this is important. We want it, and here's why we want it. We want to get better, not point out our faults. 7 was that assign, an internal project manager. So you want somebody to be coordinating and helping whoever's running your assessment, to help with the scheduling, to help resolve conflicts if they come up with, hey, we're going to meet with this person, but they're not available. Who else can we meet with? Down to just making sure all the pieces line up and get done in a logical order. Number 8 was be ready for the results. That this is it's going to shine a light on how things are, so be prepared, and lean into it. Don't take that stance of, well, oh no, they showed that this area may not be performing as well as I thought it was going to. I now need to justify it. Lean into it. Lean in and say, okay, this is where we're at. We're really starting our trip from Phoenix. Now let's figure out, how do we get to Vegas? I now know where I'm at. Let's start taking these things and taking action on them. So those are our 8 tips there. Let me show our contact information. So feel free to reach out to me directly, and we can help you with your assessment or potentially any other sort of ITSM related issues you might have. Also, please visit our website, see the services that we offer, as well as we have a very active YouTube channel. So we're constantly posting videos of what we're doing, providing tips, those types of things. So please check that out and see what we have available. And with that, I thank you for your time, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks very much, everybody. Have a great day.